Welcome to Come Follow Me, week 52. We made it. Isn't that amazing? Now, you're probably expecting something about Christmas, but I'm not going to do that because I figured you guys could handle Christmas and you don't want me to go on about why we celebrate it in December, all the pagan tradition. It just ruined the mood. So I'm not going to go there. Instead, I'm going to do this special edition about what happens between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, if you're Jewish, you call this 400-year gap here the Second Temple period. If you're Christian, you would call it the Intertestamental period, the time between Malachi and John the Baptist or the New Testament. There's a 400-year gap here. So what happened in these 400 years? Well, if you think about what's happened in the church in the last 5 years, you'd be amazed, right? Well, what about the last 200 years? And what if we didn't have prophets to guide us? So the majority of the Old Testament is what we would call the First Temple period. The worship there was mostly unchanged. There was sacrifice, and then the sacrifices were moved to the temple. Then came the Babylonian captivity, and that changed everything because now there's no more temple. And then we see during the Second Temple period, massive changes because of political influences. We have the Babylonian Persian captivity. We have the Greek, Egyptian, Syrian overwatch. Then we have a period of time under the Hasmonean or Maccabees of independent rule. Then we have the Pax Romana, Roman rule. But none of this is in the Bible. If you look at what's between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you basically have one blank page. There was a lot written during this time period, but none of it has been what we would call canonized. The Jewish traditions changed also very dramatically from what we see in the Old Testament to what happens at the time of Christ. We have the introduction of synagogues, scribes, rabbis, Pharisees, Sadducees, and a whole host of other things. So this special edition, Come Follow Me, that I'm doing this week is a basic historic overview of what happened over those 400 years. Usually when I quote sources, I give you that at the end of each source. But because most of what I'm going to say today is taken from a variety of different sources, I'm going to tell you the sources up front. One of the sources I'm using is from an Ensign article from 2014 called The Lost 500 Years. Another source is in Richmond's Section K in the Institute Manual for the Old Testament, entitled Between Testaments. A third one is Introduction to the New Testament in the Student Manual. And the fourth one is a non-LDS book called Historical and Chronological Context of the Bible from Bruce Gore. Now, I'm using these sources and compiling them all together to give you this presentation. So let's begin. God wanted Israel to be a holy nation, to become Zion, in which the Lord declared he would make his abode forever. But for years, many in Israel denied, dishonored, persecuted, fought, and rebelled against the prophets. Prophets such as Isaiah and Jeremiah warned Jerusalem citizens that if they continued to break their covenants with the Lord, the city and their temple would be destroyed. Of course, that proves true when Babylon initially invades Judah around 600 BC, destroys its villages, towns, cities, and religious life. So we have Babylon overtaking Jerusalem and the conquest that happened from 597 to 587 in a variety of stages. And we've talked about the 3 stages that it went through. Ultimately, the city is destroyed, the walls are knocked down, the temple is razed to the ground. Many people are slaughtered, many people are sent into captivity to Babylon. Some are left at home, and this constitutes mostly the poorer area, to continue their agricultural pursuits. When Babylon falls to the Persians in 539, the king of Persia, Cyrus at that time, allows the people to return to Jerusalem and build the temple. Now, just so you don't think that we're feeling very special, he actually allowed all of the captured and deported people to return to their lands and actually financed the building of many temples to all kinds of different gods. The key takeaway here is that when the people of Judah went to Babylon, they spoke Hebrew. When they come back, they've kind of lost their language. Now they're speaking Aramaic, which is kind of the common tongue of the Persian Empire. So the big dates here, we have the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Babylon. They're sent back and they rebuild the temple in 515. And then we have Ezra and Nehemiah bringing back the law to teach them. Then Jerusalem rebuilds the wall. And then by 440, approximately, Malachi is written, which we talked about last week. Then we have this 400-year gap where the people attempt to understand and live the law without the prophets' authoritative teachings and the interpretations that would come from a prophet. So what to do? During this time, we have the ascension of a group of people called scribes. Previously, they recorded the things that were said by the prophets. There weren't very many of them. They copied them and they made sure everybody had scriptures. But what happened is this group of people began to fill the void that's there. Scribes originally were educated men who made their livelihood as record keepers and as copyists of the scriptures. These they studied diligently, both to understand their meaning and to detect scribal errors. The scribes supplied copies of the scriptures to the growing number of synagogues and also became teachers of the law. While Israel had prophets, the scribes remained copyists and teachers. But when the prophetic voice ceased in Israel, these experts in the law of Moses began to fill the vacuum. They modeled themselves on Ezra, who had helped his people feel an urgency to learn and to obey the law. Then we enter a new period. The Persians have been fighting with the Greeks for about 50 years. There's this back and forth battle that goes on. Ultimately, a man named Alexander rises up and begins to conquer the Persian Empire. His father was the king of Macedon, which is in northern Greece. His father united the Greek states together, and then Alexander takes them on this 10-year campaign of conquering the world. So they conquer Palestine. And as they go into Palestine, there are a lot of legends and interesting stories here. Some people say that Jerusalem and the Jews greeted Alexander as a savior to get them out of the clutches of the previous powers. He made some significant changes to what was going on in Jerusalem. He introduced tax collectors. He introduced the idea of day labor, and then also helped to inaugurate, he supported the Sanhedrin, which was a local council to govern Judah. But the problem is that within 10, 11 years, he died, and he left no one designated to take over the kingdom. And he basically said on his deathbed, let the strongest one prevail. So what occurs is that his empire is divided between 4 different generals that were his good friends. The Greeks at this time really felt that their culture was the best that there was in the world. And so they started this whole idea of Hellenization, this idea that everybody should be Greek, should have Greek customs. They introduced the Greek language, Greek government. Everything was Greek-centric. So the people began to lose their local languages. And this happened also to many of the Jews who were dispersed through the kingdom. Everybody began to speak Greek. And so within a very short time, the Jews realized that many of their population who no longer spoke Hebrew nor read Hebrew were able to read the scriptures. They authorized the translation of the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, to be translated into Greek so that all people could read it. And you'll sometimes see this Greek Old Testament called LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, which is the Septuagint. And this, from a legend that springs up, that 70 scholars translated the entire work within 70 days. I'm not going to go into that, but that's part of the legend. this area that Alexander the Great conquered is divided into 4 sub-areas, each governed by a Greek general. Ultimately, it shrinks down, and there's some wars that go on, but we're going to talk about just 2 of the areas. This northern area, which becomes known as the Seleucid Kingdom, and this lower area, which is Egypt, that is governed by Ptolemy. Has a P in the front, but it's kind of silent. And you'll notice that Jerusalem, that Judah, the kingdom of Judah, is right smack in the middle. And so frequently there's a war over who owns Judah. Sometimes it's governed by Egypt, sometimes it's governed by this northern kingdom. And there's a lot of back and forth. But remember, both kingdoms are basically Greek. In fact, a little known story is that we think of Cleopatra, I'll use her, from Egypt, as being Egyptian, right? Well, she is born in Egypt, but she's of Greek descendancy. She comes from Ptolemy. Her ancestry is basically Greek. So all the leaders of these different kingdoms are of Greek origin. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Greek period. Depending on who was the leader, sometimes they were very willing to allow the Jews to worship according to however they wanted to. By the year 167, the northern kingdom was in control, and they decided that the only way to subjugate the Jews was to eliminate their religion, eliminate their methods of sacrificing, and to basically force them to become Greeks. And so in 167 BC, they defile the temple. They go in, set up all their Greek gods, offer sacrifices, and forbid the people to worship the way that they normally do. Jewish sacrifice is forbidden. Circumcision is forbidden. A lot of stuff happens where they just try to stamp out the Jewish religion. After Alexander, his kingdom is divided among his generals. In time, Palestine comes under the influence of the Greek-speaking Seleucid emperors. In 167 BC, these rulers, believing that a complete Hellenization of the region would bring stability to the kingdom, outlaw the Jewish faith, forbidding circumcision, Jewish scriptures, and desecrating the temple by sacrificing swine, eventually placing an altar to the pagan gods over the temple altar. Many Jews resist. During this time, a priest named Mattathias, who's of the family of Hasmon, and his 5 sons lead a Jewish revolt. This is called the Maccabean Revolt. You can see here a little diagram. Judas, who's one of the sons, becomes a very famous general, and he is called the Hammer of God. What actually happens is that Mattathias is a priest, and when the local Greek governors come in and are taking taxes and forcing the people to make a pagan sacrifice, he's had enough, and he actually kills the Greek official, and then he and his family run to the mountains and start a rebellion. The rebellion lasts for about 3 years, and they eventually defeat their Greek overlords, and they cleanse the temple, and temple worship is restored. Now, we see this today celebrated during Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not in the Old Testament because it happened in this intertestamental period. And you can see that they have the normal 7-candled menorah here, but on Hanukkah, they have a 9-candle one. And the reason behind this was the fact that during the temple cleansing, there wasn't enough oil to last the entire 8 days, but miraculously it did. And so they bring out a special menorah, the Hanukkah menorah, during this season. It has 9 candlesticks. So during the Hasmonean period, Israel gets their independence back. And you can see that the country itself grows back to a similar size to what it was previously. Maccabean leaders succeed in establishing an independent Jewish state for the first time in over 400 years. Simon Maccabeus, a son of Mattathias, became both high priest and governor of Judah, thus establishing the Hasmonean dynasty. At the same time, another religious group formed, known as the Pious. They showed their devotion to God by trying to live every aspect of the law of Moses as they understood it. We also have at this time the reestablishment of a Samaritan temple. You remember we talked about this during the Old Testament time. A Samaritan temple had existed on Mount Gerizim by the mid-5th century BC, but it was destroyed and then rebuilt in the 2nd century BC, only to be destroyed again by Jewish forces under the Maccabees. Now we're introduced to a new group, the Pharisees, who are an independent religious group that came into being soon after the Maccabean War. They became very influential in Jewish society by introducing a narrow focus on food laws and on ritual purity, aspects that were rooted primarily in their oral traditions, not in scripture. In their homes, they tried to behave as if they were living in the temple. Now, you'll see in the New Testament, as we get into it next year, that the Savior takes issue with the Pharisees from time to time. We also are introduced to the Sadducees, whose origins remain somewhat unknown. They rejected any appeal to the oral tradition, unlike the Pharisees, and held strictly to the 5 books of Moses, turning their backs on the writings of the other prophets. This group consisted mostly of the elite in Jerusalem society. By the time Jesus was born, they had expanded their power by asserting control over the Jerusalem temple. So we have the elites controlling the temple, and then we have the Pharisees following these oral traditions. Now enters the Romans. There is a great general named Pompey, not to be confused with Pompeii, which was a city. Pompey the Great went down and conquered Egypt, and on his way there, he also conquered Jerusalem. Originally, the Hasmonean Empire was in trouble. They were having some dissensions and some difficulties. They asked for Roman help. And the problem with asking for Roman help is once you ask and they come, they tend to stay. And so that's what happened. Very quickly, the descendants of the Hasmoneans forgot that it was the Lord who had delivered them. Like Saul and David and Solomon, the members of the new dynasty were corrupted by power and glory of the courts of power. The sons and grandsons of the Maccabees degenerated into a mode of politics as usual, and just over 100 years later, in 63 BC, Israel was conquered by the Roman general Pompey. When Pompey took Judah for Rome, he appointed one of the Hasmoneans to be king. Antipater, an advisor to the Jewish puppet king, quickly ingratiated himself with Rome and took over power. Antipater was an Idumean, and you remember these were the cousins of the Jews, a people that the Jews hated. He consolidated his power by helping Rome in their struggle against the Parthians, who were to the east. They constantly threatened Rome's interest. For his aid, he was granted the right to have his son appointed king of Judah. Now, this is where we begin to remember our New Testament. His son was Herod the Great. Now, if you remember Herod, he was very brutal. He thought nothing of killing thousands of babies. But he was a very able administrator, and he was extremely loyal to Rome. And he was kind of half Jewish. But he continued to Hellenize or Greekify Judah. And he had many, many building programs that helped this Hellenization as well as the people. One of the things that he's most known for is his expansion of the temple. You remember that Zerubbabel was the one who helped initially rebuild the temple, but Herod added massively to it. His construction took decades to finish. And so after a time, it became known as Herod's temple. When Herod died, he had 3 sons. And so he divided his kingdom into 3 and allowed each of his sons to be king over this specific area. The problem that one of his sons, like his father, was quite evil, but unlike his father, was very incompetent. And so he was basically replaced. The area around Jerusalem was ruled by someone that was sent from Rome. And by the time of Jesus Christ, this individual was Pontius Pilate. It wasn't until this time that the temple, the renovation that Herod had begun years before, was actually finished. During the time of Christ, the renovation was still ongoing. It was quite an elaborate structure, quite an elaborate addition that he made to the temple. Okay, then we get into some of the New Testament stories. And we begin with the visitation of an angel in the Holy of Holies. From Luke, we hear, "Thy prayer is heard." Remember, Elizabeth was barren. "Thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and he shall go in the spirit and power of Elias," which is a forerunner, "to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." And we have the birth of John the Baptist. So, was it 400 years of silence? Well, there weren't any prophets, but certainly you can see that there was a lot of history that went on, a lot of things that happened. And there were, in fact, a lot of books that were written. If you look at the 1611 original King James Version, you get into an area at the back of the Old Testament that's called the Apocrypha. And one of the books is the book of Maccabees, and that's where we get a lot of our history from, especially about the Maccabean rebellion, was from the first and second book of Maccabees. And so this Apocrypha contained many books that we don't see in our Bible today. But it was in the Septuagint, the Greek version contained these Greek writings. The Latin Vulgate translated these Greek Apocrypha, all of these writings, into Latin. And the Holy Bible, or the King James Version of 1611, also had the Apocrypha. In fact, you'll remember when we talked in the Doctrine and Covenants that Joseph Smith went to the Lord and said, "Should I translate these?" And the Lord said, "No, it's not necessary." The early Christian fathers had access to these books. The early Christian church had access to these books. The apostles had access to these books, and many others that we don't have anymore. But what happened? Well, in the United States, during the time of Joseph Smith and for a period of 50 to 100 years afterwards, there was this dichotomy that occurred. The people were trying to differentiate the Protestants from the Catholics. And one way to do this was to eliminate the Apocrypha, to eliminate these books that had been tacked on that were originally written in Greek. And so that's what happened. The Protestant Bible no longer contains the Apocrypha. However, the Catholic Bible does. And so there was this differentiation that happened. After the creation of the United States, the early Americans were very anti-Catholic. It was fairly easy to figure out who was a Catholic by simply looking at what scriptures they had and what was contained in their books. The reason I went through all of this history was to tell you that by the time Christ comes onto the scene, Jewish society and the Jewish religion had fractured substantially. We have Pharisees, we have scribes, we have Sadducees, we have Herodians, we have Zealots, we have Essenes. And into this fractured society, this troubled society that was being ruled by the Romans, steps Jesus Christ with a new idea, a new gospel, a new thought, Christianity. This causes a lot of problems. Okay, well, that's where we're going to wrap up today. I hope you've enjoyed our little overview. We did 400 years in about a half an hour. Thanks for hanging with me all of this year. I appreciate the subscribers that are helping us to push this message forward. I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season. I hope you've enjoyed our overview for this week. Next week, I'm taking a vacation, so I will see you again in 2 weeks. The first week of the Old Testament, Come Follow Me, basically says everybody's responsible to study the scriptures. And I think that if you're watching this podcast, that you probably get that idea. So I will see you in 2 weeks. Have a great holiday.